In 1933, a meal was not entertainment. It was survival. There is a pot on the stove. It has been there since morning. The burner is low. The smell coming off it is something between bread and earth and salt, something warm in a way that central heating never quite managed to be. There is one bowl on the table, one spoon, one person, and that pot is going to feed that person for 3 days. We had a whole system once, a whole language of meals built around one pot, a little heat, and whatever cost almost nothing at the market. Meals that required patience, but not money, knowledge, but not equipment, a cast iron pot and time. We didn't lose these meals because they stopped working. They worked. Every single one of them worked. We lost them because someone needed us to forget they existed, and they had the advertising budget to make sure we did. These are 25 of them, one pot, less than $1 each, and they are better than anything that came in a box. Number 25, navy bean soup. A pound of dried navy beans cost 7 cents in 1933. You soaked them overnight in cold water. In the morning you drained them, covered them fresh, dropped in a piece of salt pork the size of your fist, half an onion, and a pinch of black pepper. You put the pot on low and you went about your day. By afternoon the beans had surrendered. They had given everything they had to the water, their starch, their body, their quiet, earthy flavor. The salt pork had dissolved into the broth in a way that no bouillon cube has ever replicated. The whole pot cost 8 cents. In Appalachian Kentucky and eastern Tennessee through the 1930s, a pot of navy bean soup fed one person for 4 to 5 days. Not as a punishment, as a system. You ate it hot the first night, thick the second. By the third day, it had set up almost solid in the bowl, and that was when it was best. That was the whole meal. That was enough. Number 24, Mulligan stew. Nobody owned this recipe. That was the point. In the hobo camps along the railroad lines, the ones that stretched through Illinois and Ohio and Kansas and California in the early 1930s, a Mulligan stew started with whoever arrived first and had something. A potato, a handful of dried beans, a carrot pulled from a field at the edge of town. The next man in added what he carried. The next one after him did the same. You ate what was in the pot. Sometimes there was meat. Usually there wasn't. It didn't matter, because nobody came to a Mulligan fire alone. You came to be fed, and you came to feed someone else with whatever you had. The stew was never the same twice. It was never supposed to be. This was not poverty cooking. This was community before the word became a hashtag. These were men and women and children who understood that a pot shared between 10 people feeds everyone better than 10 pots, each feeding one. We have a word for that now. We call it potluck. We serve it in church basements. We have forgotten where it came from. Number 23, cornmeal mush. A pound of cornmeal cost 3 cents in 1933. You boiled water, salted it, poured the meal in slow while you stirred, and kept stirring until it thickened into something smooth and heavy and golden. You ate it hot from the pot with a little lard or bacon drippings pooled in the center, melting slow. In the rural South and across the Midwest Farm Belt, this was breakfast for families from the early 1900s through the 1940s. A pot of mush cost 3 cents and fed one person for 2 mornings. What you didn't eat hot, you poured into a pan, let it set, sliced it cold the next day, and fried it in an iron skillet until the edges went crisp and brown. Here's what the food industry doesn't want you to know. Today they pour that exact same meal into a fancy bag and sell it as polenta. $14 a plate at Italian restaurants in cities where nobody remembers what a depression was. Same grain, same water, same salt. Different zip code, different price, different name, and not one thing about it is better. Grandma just called it mush. She made it for 3 cents. She was right. Number 22, salt pork and potatoes. Salt pork was the working poor's refrigerator. You packed it in salt to preserve it. It kept for months. When you were ready, you sliced it thin, rinsed off what salt you could, and put it in a pot with potatoes cut into rough chunks, water to cover, and black pepper. That was the whole recipe. In the fishing towns along the New England coast and in the Ozark Hill country of Missouri and Arkansas through the 1920s and 1930s, this was not a side dish. This was supper. The salt pork did 3 jobs at once. It was the fat that carried the flavor, the protein that made the meal, and the seasoning that turned plain potato water into broth. An 11-cent pot fed a person for 2 days. Nothing in that pot was hired to do one thing when it could do 3. That efficiency wasn't an accident. It was knowledge. The kind of knowledge you earn from feeding a family on almost nothing for years at a time. Number 21. Tomato gravy. You opened a can of tomatoes 12 cents for the big can in 1935. You made a roux in the bottom of the pot, lard and flour, cooked until it went pale gold. You poured the tomatoes in, broke them up with a spoon, let it cook down thick and dark. You ate it over biscuits or yesterday's cornbread or plain over rice. In the sharecropper cabins of the Mississippi Delta, this was a meal made from almost nothing. But here is the thing they knew and didn't know they knew. Pellagra. The devastating niacin and nutrient deficiency disease swept through communities across the rural South in the 1930s and killed thousands. It struck hardest in the places that had stopped eating their traditional foods. The tomatoes weren't just flavor. The acid in those canned tomatoes unlocked the nutrients in everything else they ate. The gravy was the medicine, and nobody called it that. She was right. Everything she knew was right. She just couldn't have told you the chemistry. Number 20. Split pea soup. Dried split peas cost 5 cents a pound in 1920, and they cost almost nothing now, and they have always been the same. You didn't need a ham hock, though. If you had one, you used it. You put the peas in a pot with water, a rough-cut onion, a pinch of salt, and thyme. They dissolved into themselves. They didn't need to be blended. They thickened on their own until the spoon stood up in them. In the Scandinavian immigrant communities of Minnesota and Wisconsin, split pea soup was called ärtsoppa, and Swedish and Norwegian grandmothers made it every Thursday, the same way their grandmothers had made it in the old country, the same way their great-grandmothers had made it before that. A bowl cost 5 cents. It kept for a week. Campbell's canned this exact recipe in 1897. They put it in a red and white can, charged a markup, and sold it back to the immigrant grandmothers who had been making it for free for 3 generations. That is not progress. That is the oldest trick in the book. Number 19. Hopping John. Black-eyed peas, rice, a piece of salt pork, a chopped onion, water, cooked together in one pot until the peas went soft and the rice absorbed everything, the fat, the salt, the dark, fragrant liquid from the peas. 7 cents for the whole pot in the 1930s. Most people know Hopping John as the New Year's Day dish. Eat it on January 1st for luck, for prosperity, for the year ahead. In the Gullah communities of the South Carolina Low Country and the Georgia Sea Islands, they knew something the rest of the country didn't. You didn't eat it once a year. You ate it all year. Because black-eyed peas were not just food. They fixed nitrogen in the soil. They grew in sandy coastal ground where almost nothing else would take hold. The crop and the meal were the same intelligence, the same answer to the same hard question. What do we eat when the land gives us almost nothing? They ate this, and the land recovered, and they ate it again. Number 18. Crackling cornbread stew. When you rendered lard from fatback, what was left in the pan were cracklings, the crisp, salty, deeply savory remnants of the pork skin. In the farm kitchens of Georgia and Alabama through the 1930s, those cracklings went into the cornbread batter. The cornbread baked. Then pieces of that cornbread went into a pot with water, wild onion pulled from the yard, whatever broth was left from the week, and cooked down into something between a soup and a porridge. 4 cents for the whole pot. Nothing from the hog was discarded. The meat was eaten. The fat was rendered into lard for cooking. The skin became cracklings that went into the bread. The bread went back into the pot. Every stage fed the next stage. This was not making do. This was a closed system with no waste and no gaps. Systems thinking before anyone used that phrase, before anyone wrote a business book about it, before efficiency became something you had to be taught, they already knew. Number 17, potato soup with milk. Potatoes, whole milk, a little butter or lard, salt, nothing else. You cubed the potatoes and cooked them in water until they were just soft, then added the milk and let it warm through never boil until the starch from the potatoes thickened the milk into something silky and white and deeply simple. 9 cents for the pot. In the Irish immigrant neighborhoods of South Boston and the back of the yards in Chicago, this was the soup that showed up when someone was sick, when money was short, when January went on too long. 3 generations removed from the Great Famine, Irish-American grandmothers still kept potatoes in a pot on low heat all day. They couldn't have told you why exactly. It was just what you did when the world felt precarious. You made the potato soup. Memory lives in recipes longer than it lives in words. The story of what happened gets lost. The soup stays. Number 16. Pinto beans and fatback. Pinto beans, fatback, a rough-cut onion, water, and all the time in the world. You soaked the beans overnight. You cooked them low and slow for most of a day, the fatback giving the pot everything it had, fat and salt, and the particular sweetness of long-rendered pork. 6 cents for the whole pot in the 1920s. Texas ranch hands called them cowboy caviar, not as a joke, as a compliment, because they knew what those beans were worth. A pot of pintos contained the same amount of protein as a chicken breast, more fiber than almost anything else on the table. They kept you full across a 12-hour workday in the saddle across the high desert of New Mexico and West Texas. Modern fitness culture rediscovered beans around 2019. Nutritionists wrote articles. Wellness podcasts did episodes. Cowboys knew this in 1922. They knew it because they needed to, because there was no margin for a meal that didn't hold you. They ate the beans. They kept riding. Number 15. Stewing hen and rice. A stewing hen is an old laying hen, a chicken who has stopped laying eggs and is no longer useful to a farm in that way. In the 1930s, she cost almost nothing at the market. Sometimes she was free. You put her in a pot whole, covered her with water, brought it to a boil, and then dropped it to a slow simmer, and left her there for 2 hours. What came out of that pot was not the thin, pale water that comes from a grocery store chicken. It was dark gold. It was thick with collagen from joints and bones that had been working hard for years. It smelled like the thing chicken broth is trying to be when it grows up. You added rice. The rice absorbed everything. The whole pot cost 18 cents in rural Georgia and Mississippi and the Carolinas in the 1930s, and it fed one person for 3 days. The food industry replaced the stewing hen with boneless, skinless chicken breast in the 1970s. Uniform, efficient, fast cooking, flavorless. The flavor went with the hen. They told us it was progress. That is not progress. That is a trade we should not have made. Number 14. Savory oatmeal. Not the oatmeal with brown sugar and raisins and a spoonful of honey. This is the other oatmeal. Rolled oats cooked in water with salt, finished with a spoonful of bacon drippings stirred in at the end. The drippings kept in a jar on the back of the stove the way every grandmother kept them. 3 cents a serving in Appalachian, Pennsylvania, and West Virginia through the early 1900s. Here's what the food industry doesn't want you to know. The fat in those bacon drippings slowed the absorption of glucose from the oats into the bloodstream. The result was steady, sustained energy across a 6-hour coal mining shift underground. No crash. No hunger at 10 in the morning. Just fuel, clean and long burning, for 3 cents. The protein bar industry is worth $11 billion. It exists to solve a problem that 3 cents of oatmeal and bacon drippings already solved 100 years ago. The miners didn't need a label. They needed to make it through the shift. They did. Number 13, lentil soup with vinegar. Lentils, onion, garlic, water, and at the end a splash of apple cider vinegar. That was it. 5 cents a bowl in the Italian and Greek immigrant tenements of Lower Manhattan and the South Side of Chicago in the early 1900s. One pot, 1 hour, nothing wasted. The vinegar wasn't an accident, and it wasn't just for flavor. Acid, any acid, vinegar or lemon or tomato, increases the bioavailability of the non-heme iron in lentils by up to 70%. More of the iron your body needs actually gets absorbed when acid is present. Italian and Greek grandmothers did not read nutrition journals. They did not attend seminars. They tasted their way to the same conclusion that biochemists would publish papers about 50 years later. They knew things about food that we will spend the next 50 years trying to remember. The vinegar was always supposed to be there. Number 12, American goulash. Elbow macaroni, a can of tomatoes, ground beef if you had it, and if you didn't, you left it out, 1 onion, salt and pepper, everything into one pot in stages. Onion first, then meat, if using, then tomatoes, then the dry macaroni right into the liquid to cook and absorb and swell. 14 cents for the whole pot in the factory towns of Ohio and Michigan in the 1940s and 1950s. This had nothing to do with Hungary. This was the meal that the wives of Detroit auto workers made when the second shift ended at 11 p.m., and there were 4 children who needed to eat before school in the morning, and there was 50 cents on the counter, and no more until Friday. It was fast 30 minutes. It was filling. It made enough for 2 dinners. Grandma just called it goulash. Today, food bloggers call it American chop suey and post photographs of it with carefully arranged parsley and act like they invented something. They didn't invent anything. They found a meal that a woman in Detroit already perfected in 1948 out of necessity that they will never understand. Number 11, ham bone and beans. The ham was gone. Every bit of meat had been eaten off it over the course of a week. What remained was the bone. And in rural Tennessee and Arkansas in the 1930s, that bone was worth more than most people today would believe. You put it in a pot of water with a pound of dried white beans and onion, and you left it on low heat for most of a day. The bone gave the water everything it still had: gelatin from the cartilage, marrow from the center, salt that had worked its way into the joints, the ghost of the smoked meat that had clung to the crevices. The beans absorbed all of it. A pot of beans cooked with a ham bone tasted nothing like a pot of beans cooked without one. The difference was not subtle. The bone cost nothing. It was what was left. And what was left did more work in that pot than most ingredients do when they arrive fresh. Nothing that had value was ever thrown away. That was the rule. That was the whole rule. Number 10, creamed chipped beef. Soldiers had a name for it that cannot be repeated here. Grandmothers called it supper. Either way, it cost 9 cents, and nobody left the table hungry. Dried beef that had been salt-cured and sliced paper thin went into a pan with butter and flour to make a roux, then milk poured in slow and stirred until it thickened into a cream sauce the color of old ivory. The dried beef rehydrated in the sauce, turned silky, gave the whole thing a deep, salty umami that fresh beef could not have produced. You spooned it over toast. You ate it at breakfast or at dinner. You ate it in working-class households across the country from the 1930s through the 1950s. It was not glamorous. It was not photogenic. It was warm and filling and complete, and it cost almost nothing. 9 cents a pot. That was all it ever needed to be. Number 9, pot liquor and cornbread. Collard greens had cooked in that pot for 2 hours with a piece of fatback and a handful of black pepper. What remained in the bottom was not broth. It was darker than broth, silkier, the color of strong tea left too long on the stove. She ladled it into a bowl, crumbled yesterday's cornbread on top, and set it in front of you. In the rural South and the Appalachian coalfields of the 1930s, pot liquor was considered the poorest meal a family could serve. Nutritionists at Tuskegee University documented it differently. Every vitamin the greens surrendered during 2 hours of cooking ended up in that liquid. Iron, calcium, folate. A bowl of pot liquor with cornbread delivered more nutrition per penny than almost anything else a Depression-era table could offer. Grandma just called it not wasting good food. 3 cents for the bowl. She was right. Everything she knew was right. Number 8. Dried corn chowder. In the farm kitchens of Iowa and Indiana through the 1920s and 1930s, the sweet corn of summer was dried on the cob and stored in burlap sacks through winter. Field corn, not sweet corn, not the corn from a can dried hard and kept for months and reconstituted in a pot of water with salt, pork, onion, and thyme into something with a depth of flavor that canned corn cannot approximate. 7 cents for the pot. And here is the thing nobody talks about. Dried field corn contains a compound that releases during long, slow cooking and thickens its own liquid. No cream, no flour, no thickener added. The starch in the corn did it on its own, if you gave it enough time and low enough heat. The chowder thickened itself. The farm women of the Midwest knew this. They didn't need a recipe that said, add 2 tablespoons of cornstarch. They needed patience and a low flame and a cast iron pot that had been in the family for 30 years. That was the whole technique. Number 7. Rice and gravy. White rice cooked in a pot with pan drippings, whatever fat and fond had accumulated in the bottom of the skillet from the week's cooking water, a chopped onion, salt. The rice absorbed everything. The fat, the smoke, the caramelized remnants of whatever meat had cooked before, the deep fond that nothing washes away without first teaching everything around it what it knows. In Louisiana, Cajun households, and along the Mississippi from the 1930s through the 1950s, rice and gravy was not a side dish. It was the meal, 5 cents a pot. It tasted like something more expensive than it was because it had absorbed the memory of something more expensive than it was. Nothing from the week's cooking was lost. The drippings kept in a jar. The jar came out on Sunday. Today, restaurants in New Orleans put a version of this on menus for $16 and call it rustic and authentic. That is not progress. That is theft with a prefix attached. Number 6. Bread soup. The bread had gone hard. In the Italian immigrant tenements of Lower Manhattan and South Philadelphia and Pittsburgh through the early 1900s, bread that had gone hard was never thrown away. It went into the pot. You broke it into rough pieces, into a shallow pot with water or thin broth, whatever you had, and an onion softened in lard. The bread absorbed the liquid. It swelled. It thickened the broth from the inside until you couldn't tell any more where the bread ended and the soup began. You finished it with a drizzle of whatever fat was available. You ate it hot. 2 cents a bowl. Today this dish shows up on Manhattan restaurant menus as ribollita, the Tuscan bread soup, $22 a bowl, served with house-made focaccia on the side. Same stale bread, same pot, same logic. The grandmother who made it in a tenement on Mulberry Street in 1912 invented nothing and discovered nothing, and she already had the answer. Same pot, different century, different price. Number 5. Salmon patties in cream sauce. Canned salmon was cheaper than fresh by 1930, 12 cents for a tall can in the Pacific Northwest and across the Great Plains. You mixed it with flour and a little salt, formed it into patties, fried them in the same pan you were going to make the sauce in. When the patties came out, you made the sauce in the drippings, flour, milk, butter, salt, and poured it back over them. 1 pan. 4 ingredients. From start to table in 20 minutes. A complete meal, protein, fat, starch for 1 person for under 15 cents. The cream sauce was not a luxury. It was how you stretched the salmon into something that filled a plate, filled a stomach, and still felt like a real meal rather than a portion. Living alone does not mean eating less. It means learning to make the right amounts of the right things. These women knew how to cook for one. They had it down to a science that nobody bothered to write down because it seemed too obvious to record. Number 4. Dandelion green soup. The greens were free. That is where this starts. In the Italian and Polish immigrant communities of western Pennsylvania and eastern Ohio through the 1910s and 1930s, dandelion greens were not a weed. They were a crop that required no planting, no tending, no cost. You went into the yard in early spring and you picked them young, before they went bitter. You wilted them in a pot with garlic softened in lard, covered them with water, and let them cook down into a dark, slightly bitter, deeply mineral soup that tasted like the ground itself was feeding you because it was. Dandelion greens contain more iron per cup than spinach, more calcium than most vegetables. The soup cost nothing. The nutrition was extraordinary. Today, foraged greens appear on restaurant menus in cities at $18 a plate. Small portions, careful plating, a story about the farmer who gathered them. Grandma pulled them from the backyard on a Tuesday morning while the coffee was still brewing and called it nothing at all. She didn't have a story. She had a pot. Number 3. Crackers and milk soup. Saltine crackers, whole milk, a knob of butter, salt. You broke the crackers into a bowl, poured the warm milk over them, dropped the butter in the center, and waited 30 seconds for it to melt. That was the recipe, 4 cents in 1930. This was dismissed when it was mentioned at all as the meal of the very old and the very sick and the very poor. It was none of those things. It was the meal of one person, living alone, who did not need to cook a full pot of beans at 9 o'clock at night. It was fast. It was warm. The milk was easy to digest. The salt steadied you. The butter made it feel like a meal rather than a snack. This was not poor man's food. This was smart food for one person who understood that not every meal needs to be a production. Some meals need to be warm and quiet and over quickly so you can sleep. Grandma knew what she needed. She made what she needed. She didn't apologize for it. Number 2. Souse. The pig's head was the part the butcher couldn't sell. In the German immigrant communities of central Pennsylvania and the Texas Hill Country through the 1800s and into the 1940s, that made it valuable because the parts nobody would pay for were the parts that stretched the farthest. You simmered the head cleaned, halved in a large pot with vinegar, bay leaf, black pepper, salt, and whatever spices the family favored for 4 to 5 hours until the meat fell from the bone. You picked the meat off, chopped it fine, packed it into a loaf pan with the cooking liquid strained over it. The gelatin in the bones and cartilage set the liquid solid overnight. In the morning you had souse sliced cold, dense, deeply savory, lasting a week in a cool pantry, 11 cents for a full pot. Modern charcuterie boards charge $24 for the same thing and call it head cheese with a small printed card explaining its provenance. Same pig, same pot, same result. The grandmother who made it in a farmhouse kitchen in Lancaster County in 1931 would not have recognized what they've done to the price. Number 1. Bone broth porridge. This is the final meal. The one that required nothing and wasted nothing and asked only for a pot and a low flame and the patience to let it work. Beef bones or pork bones bought for 2 cents from the butcher in the early 1900s, or often free, the bones he had no other use for went into the pot with cold water before bed. The flame went low. By morning the water had become something else. Dark, rich, smelling of marrow and collagen, and the long, slow chemistry of bone, surrendering everything it contained to the water around it. You added oats or rice to that liquid. You let the grain cook in it, absorb it, swell with it. You salted it. You ate it from a single bowl. This meal was not specific to one group or one region. It belonged to everyone who had almost nothing. It was made in the Eastern European immigrant neighborhoods of Chicago and Cleveland, in the black communities of the rural South, in the Appalachian hollows of West Virginia and Kentucky, in the Mexican border towns of South Texas and New Mexico. Every tradition that had survived long enough on very little had arrived at the same answer: the bones, the long water, the grain in the morning. One pot. A penny or two. Enough to carry you through the day. That was all it needed to be. That was always all it needed to be. Closing. Bone broth porridge from bones that cost 2 cents. Dandelion greens that cost nothing at all, pulled from the yard before breakfast. A ham bone working harder after the meal was gone than most ingredients do when they arrive fresh. A stewing hen giving everything she had to a pot of rice and dark gold broth. These women fed themselves, fed families, fed neighbors, fed strangers at a Mulligan fire on less than $1 a day. Not in spite of their knowledge. Because of it. They knew exactly what they were doing. Every acid and every fat and every long simmer and every saved bone was a decision made by someone who had learned, through necessity and through the kitchens of their own mothers and grandmothers, what food could do when you asked it to do everything. The food industry spent 70 years calling that knowledge old-fashioned. They said it quietly, through magazine campaigns and television advertisements and a box with a smiling woman on the front. They needed you to feel that what your grandmother knew was something to leave behind. They were wrong. The science said they were wrong. The nutrition said they were wrong. The meals themselves, every single one of them, still working, still costing almost nothing, still feeding one person for 3 days from a single pot, say they were wrong. She was right. Everything she knew was right. Comment below and tell me which one your grandmother made.